Hi all, welcome to another episode of Hashing Out the Law. I forgot the name of my own podcast. I have with me Patrick Fitzgibbons, a guest today. He has over approximately 23 years of law enforcement experience. Good morning, Patrick. How are you?
Hey, glad to be here, man. It's an honor. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being on. Could you tell the listeners and the viewers a little bit about your background? I know you have 23 years of law enforcement, but could you give them a little bit of the details, please?
Oh, sure, Arash. I started out, I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Army. Then he later went into the Air Force. So when I was old enough, I didn't go to college right away. I joined the military at 21. I was stationed down at Fort Bragg with the 82nd Airborne Division for about 4 years. During that time, I knew I wanted to pursue. I knew I was going to be a lifelong military person and stay in forever. And I always had an interest in law enforcement. I have a lot of law enforcement in my family. So I got out of the military, moved back to Colorado, and went to school while going to the academy at the same time. Graduated the academy and
Air Force Academy.
What's that?
Air Force Academy?
No. The police academy.
Police Academy.
Yeah. And so went to school at the same time and put myself through police academy. And 23 years later, I retired last year as an operations commander with my department. Went through the ranks and had a great career, but it was time to move on and retired, and I'm just having a good time.
It's great. That's awesome. Let me start by asking you this. During your 23 years as a law enforcement, what changes did you notice from when you were a rookie till you decided to retire? And when I say what changes, I'm talking about people's interaction, general public's interaction with law enforcement.
That's a great question. I mean, I think, we've all seen the news and law enforcement's, it's a tough job. We've gone through the last several years with a lot of controversy, a lot of, high profile cases. As far as, what has changed, I think, law enforcement more than ever is under a lot of scrutiny, and they should be. They have a lot of power, and the public puts a lot of trust in law enforcement. So I think there's more scrutiny now than ever on law enforcement. Some of it's justified, obviously. Some of it, I think, I think law enforcement sometimes gets a bad rap. I mean, but I think we're scrutinized more than ever, and we need to be. Like I said, I mean, it's we're law enforcement, and we have a lot of power to take somebody's life if we have to. So I can see how it's becoming more and more, or it has become more and more difficult to police.
Right. What made you decide you want to go into law enforcement? I know you touched upon it briefly, but what was that moment that I want to be a police officer?
Well, for me, it was just a natural. I mean, I wanted to help people. I wanted to I wanted to continue to serve in the capacity in a community. I mean, I served in the military, and like I said, I had a lot of or a handful of relatives that I grew up with, watching them, hearing from their stories, being a cop. I have a couple of Chicago police officer uncles in my family. So just that was probably the tipping point for me. It was exciting. It was a, adrenaline rush kind of thing. And, I was drawn to it. I mean, I was jumping out of planes, in the Army. So I was used to the adrenaline rush. So, and I wanted to serve, I wanted to continue to serve my community. And I've always had that, that was instilled in me at a very young age. So that's the reason why I wanted to get into law enforcement.
That's awesome. You said Chicago. When you said the word Chicago, your little accent came out.
Yeah.
You are from Chicago, correct?
Well, I have a lot of relatives. I was born in Waukegan, which is just outside of Chicago. And I have a lot of relatives in Chicago. And so
that's awesome. That's awesome. Off subject, I started watching The Last Dance the other day I
never seen that. Was it good or?
I started it last night, actually, so it's been out for a while. I only saw the first episode. I'm a basketball fan, and I grew up during that era, so I enjoyed it. It's not bad.
Up with the Bulls and Jordan and Scottie Pippen and all those.
Yeah. I'm a Lakers fan, Magic Johnson and all that, but Jordan was actually one of my favorite players.
Yeah.
Now,
awesome.
Let's go back to law enforcement. Any particular reason you decided to retire?
Yeah, about 4 years ago, I started a show my own podcast, CJEvolution podcast, and I just I'm really passionate about it. And quite frankly, Arash, I kind of got burned out on law enforcement. It was 23 years, and sometimes you have to step down, and I had a great career and retired on top, but I was kind of done with law enforcement. And like I said, I wanted somebody else to take my spot, young blood, get in there. So I kind of mentored a couple people to take my spot. One of them got it. But law enforcement is, you probably heard this before. I mean, it's a toxic environment. It really is. So, people don't call the police when things are going good. People call the police when things are going bad. So eventually that kind of rubs off on you. And I just knew it was time to move on. And like I said, I had a great career. I started my show, which gained traction, and I wanted to devote more time to that. I've been teaching for a number of years on the college level, criminal justice. And so, I wanted to pursue other things. And like I said, I had a great ride, and there's many different reasons why I retired, all positive. I wanted to do other things.
That's awesome. Few things came to mind while you were answering my question. One of them, you said that people don't call the police when things are going good. They call them when it's going bad. It reminds me of something. When little kids are being bad sometimes, the parents say, stop doing that or I'll call the police and they'll come take you away.
Yeah.
They're just trying to scare them. But I always thought that wasn't the right thing to say, because you're installing fear of the police in little children right when they're children. So when they grow up, they already had that in them. Whereas you should teach them that the police are your friends and they're there to protect you. So just
absolutely. I can't tell you, I've on a number of occasions when I was a young officer, I mean, because I worked in smaller agencies, and, on a number of occasions I would have a parent, usually the mother, coming to the police department with a toddler in tow, a son or a daughter, talking to me about how their kids weren't, minding them. They weren't following they weren't doing what they were told to do. And they wanted me to put them in a jail cell to scare them. And I said, nope, not doing it, for the reason you just said. We want our kids, we want our next generation, our youth, to trust the police. We want them to, give us information. We don't want to instill that fear, like you said, from a very young age, or they'll be conditioned to think, well, if I go to the police, I'll get thrown in jail.
Right.
So, I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, a lot of, I think a lot of adults kind of still have that mindset with their kids. And that's one of the things that it's a culture thing. We've tried to, change that over time. And that just comes with education. That's what I told the mom when she came the last time it happened years ago. And I said, look, I understand where you're coming from. You kind of want to, put a little fear into your, son, but that shouldn't come from the police. It should come from you. And because we don't want to have him grow up scared, being scared of the police.
I totally agree with that. 100%. Other thing came to mind is when you're retiring, time for young blood to come in. What would you tell young people who are thinking of becoming a police officer now? What would you tell them? Any tip, any advice that you would tell them?
I would tell them, and I get that question a lot. That's a great question. I would tell them to align themselves with the right officers in a department. And what I mean by the right officers, the officers that are going to mentor them and coach them and be positive and instill good habits, within them, instead of aligning themselves with the people that are cynical and bitter and don't like their job, and the world sucks and everybody is a criminal. And it's so important that young officers seek out those mentors and coaches, the right people, like I said, in a department, because that's the next generation. And it's so important. And that's where FTOs, if you know what those are, field training officers, when new officers come on board in an agency, there are field training officers that are really there to, coach and guide and mentor, and teach young officers. Now, if we have the wrong people in those leadership roles, we're doing those young people a disservice. So I always tell people, just seek out the positive, and it's a rough job, and it's not that everything's lollipops and roses all the time. You're going to have bad days, but don't be around the people who are just cynical all the time and bitter and are mean to the public, because that's just going to rub off on you.
It's great advice. I actually like that advice. the other thing you mentioned is your podcast. Now, we're going to include the link
Mhm.
in the audio version and in the YouTube version so everybody can actually click on it and go see your podcast. Tell us a little bit about your podcast and what inspired you to start it and what it's all about.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, CJEvolution, and that stands for Criminal Justice Evolution. The reason why I named it that is because criminal justice is constantly evolving. We're constantly changing. We should at least be making us better. So I started this show about 4 years ago. I think I'm up to about 360 episodes now, 362. Yeah, I love podcasts. I mean, I constantly listen to podcasts, like Tony Robbins and Gary Vee and all these other great, shows that motivate me and pump me up. And I decided, that I was going to start a show, and I was scared to death, but I wanted a show where, I wasn't just telling cop stories and war stories, and those have their place, but I wanted a show that was going to inspire and motivate and pump officers up because they see bad every day. I wanted to have something different. So, and I do talk about some somber topics, but the overall message in my show is one of positivity, motivation, inspiration, and really pumping first responders and criminal justice professionals all around the world, pumping them up. So I have people that talk about leadership, they talk about meditation, they talk about nutrition, we talk about finances, which is important for any position, let alone law enforcement. So it just kind of evolved, Arash. I mean, over the years, I just started, getting more and more people on the show. I've had New York Times bestselling authors. I've had actors. I've had ex-Navy SEALs. I've had, people from SEAL Team 6 that, are a famous SEAL team. And I mean, you name it. I've had a lot of people on the show, and I just want to continue to give back good content and continue to serve and, the first responders and criminal justice community. And I get people that aren't even in the criminal justice field that listen to my show. So I'm having a great time with it, man. It continues to grow, and I'm
That's
really
awesome.
blessed.
So your first focus was to provide information for criminal justice and first responders,
Yeah.
but it seems like your audience has expanded.
Yeah, it has. I mean, the primary demographic is still first responders and criminal justice, but I mean, I have people that have nothing to do with law enforcement and criminal justice that come on the show that I can tie back into the field. For instance, like nutritional experts and leaders in that field, or fitness experts that, really resonates with, most law enforcement. They want to stay in shape and they want to look good. So yeah, it has expanded, but the primary demographic is still, criminal justice and law enforcement.
That's awesome. So I am from LA and I am a criminal defense lawyer. So
Mhm.
I have lots of law enforcement friends and I have lots of law enforcement rivals, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term. And there are some police officers that are amazing. And I'm sure you know that LA County has the largest law
Oh, yeah.
enforcement agency in the free world, and we have the largest jail in the free world. So we have lots of interaction with the public and everything. Throughout my career, there has been some officers, law enforcement officers, that are just horrible law enforcement officers. I don't want to say people, but they're horrible law enforcement
Mhm.
officers. And LAPD and sheriffs, they've been involved in lots of scandals where the officers are planting evidence.
Yeah.
The officers are, uh, they're basically gangsters with a badge, as they
Mhm.
say.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that gives a bad name to law enforcement. How would you go about rehabilitating the image that these bad officers have created for not just their department, but law enforcement in general? Because then, across the country, we hear a lot of negative stuff about law enforcement. We hear some good stuff, but we hear lots of negative stuff.
Mhm.
What do you think needs to be done to rehabilitate that image?
That's a great question, Arash. First of all, thank you for what you do. I think everybody always, has a right to a good defense. And I agree with you. There's a lot of bad officers out there, but I think the overwhelming majority of cops are good people. The problem is that you get these dirtbags that have a gun and a badge, and nobody just says, "Oh, that's LAPD or that's Chicago PD or NYPD." Everybody just looks at a uniform and says, "All law enforcement." So that's the problem. first and foremost, you need to get rid of these people that are within the ranks. And that comes with changing the culture in law enforcement, which is an insurmountable task, but we can do it. But one of the ways, or I can give you 6 ways that law enforcement can improve their image, is through President Obama's, he came up with this task force, I believe it was in 2016, and these 6 pillars of police reform, which I really believe in. And a lot of that has to do with diversity training, get out, community policing. You've heard it all before, better education for the officers. So I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's a multifaceted approach. And then it starts with, recruiting and hiring and retaining the right people. We need to do a better job, mainly with minority communities. We need more Asian, Latinos. We need more African Americans within the department so they can better represent the community. And that's a hard task to do sometimes, depending on where you're at, but we can do it. And I just really believe a lot of that centers around community policing and have a good relationship, with the public. And that means officers get out of their car, go make contacts. I don't live in a fairy tale world. I know people out there, some just don't like the cops, for good reason. Some of it is probably not a good reason. They heard it from somebody else. They're not educating themselves. And that's a tough road. But it starts with, transparency from law enforcement, being more transparent. And that, starts with good leadership. And there's so many different areas, buddy. I mean, and I hope I'm answering your question, but I think a lot of it has to do with good communication, rebuilding those lost bridges, or rebuilding those bridges in communities. I mean, take Ferguson, for instance. That city just rattled. No matter what side you fall on, it's going to take years to rebuild, if it ever happens, the trust between the community members and the police department. But it's a two-way street. It's not just one side. Both sides have to be vested in it. So. Right.
I agree. That was it wasn't a bad answer or a good answer. It was an adequate answer, meaning it's what I wanted to see what a police officer would think.
It's just there's so many different angles to it. Right. You take social media. We could do a better job at social media. I mean, that's just one part of it. Education, like I said, training. I think a lot of officers need to, and this is part of President Obama's task force, is I think we need to get more officers into, I think it should be mandated that officers should go through, racial bias training, so we can spot that implicit bias that some officers have, and that's going to help. But a lot of it is just getting out to the communities. I have a good friend that works for LAPD, and he works in Skid Row, and really great guy, and he's a cop. And all he does every day, Arash, is that's his beat. But he's not in a car. He's not doing it from his office. He's out there talking to the homeless population. He's out there helping however he can. He's a cop, and he has to take action when he does, or enforcement action. But he is out there talking, seeing what the needs and the wants of the community are. And that's that's the bedrock of community policing. It's a partnership with the community. We can't do it alone. But this is a great cop, and that's an example. And he's an African-American cop, good friend of mine, but he's out there. He's out there talking to people. And does he connect with everybody? Does he reach everybody? No. But at least he's out there trying. And I think that's what people want to see more of with their law enforcement.
That's actually, it's a good thing you said that. LAPD started in some areas of the city to go back to foot patrols.
Yes.
So the officers can go the old ways, and they start patrolling on foot, getting to know the neighborhood, getting to know the people.
That's so important.
Yeah, I agree with that.
We are in an information business, Arash. I mean, you know that. I mean, your job as a defense attorney, it's information. Law enforcement's no different. We deal in information. Where do we get the information from? Well, from law enforcement, we get it from the public. Look, if public doesn't report stuff, how do we know about it? And they don't report stuff if they don't trust the police department.
Right, I agree. You talked about Ferguson. Let's talk about the Arbery case.
Yeah,
that's happening right now.
It's a horrible case. Disgraced.
It is a horrible case. However, that wasn't law enforcement directly, meaning that he was a retired police officer. When I say he, I'm talking about
the dad,
or the dad. Yeah.
Okay.
From what I read, but let's talk about it from a law enforcement perspective. How do you handle a case like that when you have a case that's so publicly visible and it's so it's racial, it has racial undertones, and now you're assigned this case? How do you separate your personal feelings and how do you handle this case professionally?
Well, I mean, I think you, like everything else, you got to gather all the information. First and foremost, you got to have a PIO, a public information officer, that is acting as the liaison to the media, to the police department, or whatever agency it is. And you need to keep the public informed as the case progresses. But you need to have all the information. I mean, and that's the one thing I think in this digital age we live in. People, see a certain video clip and say, "Oh my God." This on its surface is horrible. I mean, from what I read, I mean, it's just ridiculous that this guy who's jogging gets shot and killed by these idiots. But I think law enforcement, what they have to do is they have to gather all the facts and be sure that they have all their ducks in a row before they make any statements. And that is, the evidence gathering, that happened on the scene. What really shocks me about this case is that it took them, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks before they had it, maybe they were just, I imagine they were gathering more evidence to have probable cause, but, it took them a long time to make the arrest. But yeah, I mean, as far as law enforcement, you want to have all your facts. You want to be careful with what you say. You don't want to say stuff unless it's absolutely, accurate or is most accurate to your knowledge and that's through the evidence. Now, on its face, it looks like these idiots are guilty. But again, we'll know more as the case emerges and, the facts and the evidence come to light.
Yeah, it's a horrible case, and it looks like they're guilty, but
yeah, it does. I mean, it's just the way it, the way it, progressed and what I've read. I mean, I just don't get it. I mean, and it has the undertones, in my opinion, of obviously race motivated.
Right. Yeah. In fact, last I read, FBI is looking into it as hate crime. So we'll see where that goes. Let me ask you another question about this case. And what do you think the implications of this outcome of this case, whatever the outcome is, it's going to be for law enforcement? Like, and I know I said that this isn't directly a law enforcement action, but do you think it will have negative or positive implications for law enforcement when it's over and done?
Well, I think it could have negative consequences. Mainly, why did law enforcement wait so long to make an arrest? Now, their argument would probably be, well, we're gathering evidence, but I think that can have a negative implication for law enforcement down there in Georgia, because they didn't make an arrest and quickly. And I understand from a law enforcement perspective, you want to gather all the evidence. You have to have PC to make an arrest, and I get that. But if they had, the question is, if they had enough evidence to make the arrest from the onset or earlier on, and they didn't make the arrest, well, then it just erodes the public trust, and then it kind of goes back into that racial undertone. These two guys were white, the victim was African American. So I think this has a very good chance of having negative consequences for law enforcement. Law enforcement's already, from day one, they were getting heat about this case and why they haven't made an arrest. So it's going to be interesting to see. And and really quick, my heart goes out to the family and the friends of this of the victim in this case. It's horrible.
Yeah, I agree with you. From what I read, he was loved by the community. Everybody knew him. He would wave to people.
Just jogging, man. And so from what I gather, he might have looked inside a house or something. And when he was leaving, he didn't have anything on his person. And let's just say he did have something in his hand. Let's just play devil's advocate here for a minute. Did he deserve to die?
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
I agree.
It's just insane.
I agree. Yeah. I think the implication it will have, I think it will have negative implications on law enforcement.
Oh, yeah.
Because of where it is. It's deep South. You have a couple of white guys. You have a black man, and it's a small town. Law enforcement took their
politics.
Time. Good old boy network is gonna. They're gonna all those conspiracy theories. I think in the long run, it's gonna be bad for law enforcement. at least local law enforcement.
Mhm.
I know you're a busy man. I don't want to take up a lot of your time. I see you have a sign behind you that says, hustle until your haters ask if you're hiring. I like that. That's very good. That's a good
Yeah,
one.
you like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I believe in, hustling, and I believe in, whatever you want. I do a lot of coaching, a lot of speaking, Arash, and I believe so much in mindset, and having the correct mindset. And yeah, I mean, you just have to hustle in life, and whatever you want, you can obtain. You just got to believe in yourself and believe in your abilities. And yeah, I got that sign because I had a buddy of mine I went to high school with this was years ago, who he was kind of a nerd, and everybody kind of, you know, was making fun of him all the time. And I was a really good friend of him, and him and I were buddies for many years, and everybody was always making fun of him. And yeah, he's never going to amount to anything. Well, this guy graduated, went off to college, and I think at one time he was number 5 in Microsoft.
Awesome.
So, so everybody was asking him for a job.
Right.
So that's why I love that. So
That's great. You mentioned coaching. You coach. Tell us a little bit about that.
yeah, I coach mainly criminal justice professionals, first responders, and the premise behind my coaching is called Evolve, and it's a micro book that I wrote for first responders, and it's a tiny little book. That Evolve is an acronym, and the acronym is first of all, the E is elevate your thinking. Everything starts with mindset. Having the correct mindset. V stands for visualization. Whatever you want, you need to visualize it, because research shows the more you visualize and the more law of attraction, the more, the more likely it is to come to fruition. The O stands for others, who you're surrounding yourself with. I mentioned it earlier when you asked me what advice would I give to new officers. Well, others. Surround yourself with the right people, not the wrong people. The L is love yourself, man. If you don't love yourself first, how are you going to love everybody else or take care of anybody else? It's like you get on a plane and you're maybe not now, but when it gets better, you get on a plane and they're giving you a safety briefing and the oxygen mask drop. You put it on yourself first, right? You got to take care of yourself first before you can take care of others. And that includes loving yourself. Loving yourself. Law enforcement is so good for the most part to take care of others, but we're not really good for the most part taking care of ourselves. And V is you are victorious, and E is every day be your best. So again, that's the basis behind the coaching, and I get into a lot more with first responders. And as you can tell, I'm not talking about use of force. I'm not talking about handcuffing. That's not the kind of coaching I do. My coaching is up here in developing that right mindset so you can become the best law enforcement professional you can be, not only for yourself, but for the community.
That's awesome. And can the listeners and viewers get a copy of the book on your website?
Absolutely. So if you go to my website, everything is there. My podcast, my coaching, my speaking stuff. I'm not doing a lot of speaking now, but if you want, I have 2 versions of I have a hard copy, which unfortunately I had to order some more from my publisher. But anybody has to do is just send me a message. If you want an autographed hard copy from me, send through LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. LinkedIn is probably my biggest platform. Or if you want an ebook version, again, CJEvolution.com. It's all right there.
That's awesome. We'll be sure to include the link for all our listeners and viewers. Thank you for being on. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, Arash. Yeah, man. Thank you for what you do, brother. And I appreciate it. It's a great show. And thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. You have a great day.
You too.